the FBI says it is investigating what appears to be an attempted assassination attempt of former President Donald Trump. We are told the former president is safe after shots were fired in his vicinity while he was golfing at his club in West Palm Beach, Florida.
After decades without political violence directed at a presidential candidate from one of the major parties, the US has now experienced this twice in the space of 2 months, with former President Donald Trump the target on both occasions. Is this the new normal in US politics, and what does the future look like if it is? Here to help us answer that from the United States Study Centre, Associate Professor in American Politics and Foreign Policy at the University of Sydney, David Smith. David, thanks for joining us.
Good afternoon.
And so we've seen another incident, another attempted assassination of Donald Trump. America has a history of presidential assassinations. How has political violence shaped US democracy over the years?
Yeah, well, 4 American presidents out of 46 have been assassinated. There are others who have survived assassination attempts, most recently Ronald Reagan in 1981. So compared to other advanced industrial democracies like Australia, there has been a lot more violence at the heart of American politics. And this is far from the most violent period of American political history that we have lived through. If we go back to the 1960s, John F. Kennedy was killed in 1963. His brother, Robert F. Kennedy, was killed while he was running for president in 1968. That was the same year that Martin Luther King was also assassinated. And political violence in the 1960s was so commonplace that often things like bombings wouldn't even make the front pages of the newspaper. So the United States does have this history of violence being used for political purposes. It does, it ebbs and flows, but one of the constant things that is present in the United States is that it's a fairly heavily armed society. So that when people feel that they need to resort to violence or they should to resort to violence, they have the means at hand.
Yeah, so it sounds as though the big difference here, why we see this happen in America and not, say, Australia, is in Australia you might have people who feel disenfranchised by the political system, but they don't have the same access to firearms, so you're less likely to see these types of incidents. Do you think that's a fair observation?
I think it is a fair observation. And along with the access to firearms, there's also, I think, a real copycat effect. The FBI said that the person who shot at Donald Trump at the Pennsylvania rally earlier this year, he had done research on Lee Harvey Oswald's shooting of John F. Kennedy. So there's this real sense that once it happens a few times in a country, it's just a lot more likely to happen because people see it as a way of achieving something. So the fact that there has, as far as I'm aware, never been a successful assassination of an Australian political figure, with the exception of John Newman in 1991, that combined with the relative lack of access of firearms really just makes something like political assassination far less likely in Australia.
It does feel as though that the political environment in America has changed for the worst over the last few years. Is that a reflection of the influence of Donald Trump and how his style of politics has permeated through America?
I think that Donald Trump has accelerated something that was already going on in American politics. You could see violent rhetoric rising even before Trump became the president. I think that the way that Trump divides everything into friends and enemies, the kind of apocalyptic rhetoric that he uses, even things like accusing immigrants of eating pets, they all contribute to this atmosphere where people see their political enemies as so intolerable that they might be motivated to take violent action against them. The Public Religion Research Institute has just released some new survey data where they asked people whether they agreed with the question that true American patriots may have to resort to violence in order to save our country. And they found that 16% of Americans agreed with that. Now, that obviously is far from a majority, but in a country of 330 million people, when you have 16% believing that in order to save the country, you have to resort to violence, that really is, it makes acts of violence, unfortunately, almost inevitable. Now, Trump is not completely responsible for this, but he has certainly contributed to it. And part of it is his rhetoric that the country needs to be saved, that the country is dying, that it has been so undermined, that it's such a violent and horrible place that it needs to be saved by patriots. Because I think that is when people really are most likely to resort to violence. It's if they feel that the country needs to be saved, and certainly Trump's rhetoric has contributed to that.
Yeah, it's almost a style of radicalization, sort of uniting for a cause, even though that cause may not be as legitimate as it may be pitched. And so now, in the wake of this latest incident, is it possible to put the genie back in the bottle, or is this now the reality of US politics going forward?
I think it's going to be very hard to turn the temperature down in the immediate term. And one of the problems is just the sheer availability of guns. If the reports about the person in detention who's suspected of planning the shooting are correct, this was someone who twice in 2002 faced charges of owning a weapon of mass destruction. This is someone who barricaded himself in a building with a machine gun when he was pulled over by police. This is somebody who went to Ukraine to try to recruit Afghan soldiers fleeing the Taliban to go to fight in Ukraine. This is someone with a very, very strange and violent past, with a lot of use of weapons and making a lot of violent threats. This is someone who was able to obtain a semi-automatic weapon and get within, reportedly, about 400 or 500 meters of the President of the United States. And that's even with the beefed up Secret Service detail that Trump now has after the last shooting attempt. This kind of mass availability of weapons means that even when the political temperature eventually comes down, these events are still going to be almost inevitable.
Yeah, I think you might be absolutely right. It's just a terrible, terrible state of affairs indeed. From the University of Sydney, David Smith, thanks as always for sharing your insights on the Nightly Five.
My pleasure.